Rachel was a doctor who had spent most of her career in bustling city hospitals, far removed from the quiet and mystique of the rural regions. Her life was a series of patient care shifts, surgeries, and diagnostic procedures, all carried out in the sterile environment of the modern world. However, an unexpected letter pulled her away from the life she knew, summoning her to a remote village that many had never even heard of. The village was hidden deep in the heart of a forest, surrounded by dense, towering trees that whispered ancient secrets to those who dared to listen. Rachel had been called to this isolated place because of a strange affliction that had plagued its people for years, a condition that no doctor had been able to cure. The villagers could not sleep. No one knew why or how it had started, but night after night, they remained awake, their eyes hollow and filled with dread as they waited for a sleep that never came. Rachel's curiosity drove her forward. As a doctor, she had seen many odd cases, but nothing as peculiar as this. She needed to know what caused such widespread insomnia. Was it a new disease, some strange environmental factor, or perhaps something more sinister? Her journey into the village was long and arduous. The path wound through ancient forests, crossing rivers and treacherous hills, and as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the landscape, she finally arrived. The village was quiet, unnaturally so. As Rachel walked through the streets, she noticed the people moving sluggishly, their faces gaunt and weary, eyes bloodshot from endless nights without rest. An old woman approached her, shuffling slowly as though her legs could barely carry her any longer. Her hair was gray, her skin weathered from years of exposure to the elements, but her eyes still carried a spark of knowing. She was the village's guide, the one who knew the ancient tales and the dark history of this cursed place. "You've come," the old woman rasped, her voice a low whisper. "We've been waiting." Rachel nodded, unsure of what to expect but eager to understand the strange affliction that had taken hold of these people. "I was sent to help," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. She felt a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. The old woman turned, motioning for Rachel to follow. "There is much you need to know before you can understand the curse that keeps us awake." As they walked through the dimly lit streets, the old woman began to tell the tale. Long ago, before Rachel's time, the village had been peaceful. The people worked the land, tending to their crops and animals, living simple lives. But that peace was shattered when a dark ritual was performed by an outsider, someone who had come from far away, seeking power beyond their wildest dreams. The outsider had promised the villagers great prosperity if they helped him perform the ritual. He claimed that it would bring them wealth, fertile lands, and a life free from hardship. Desperate for a better life, the villagers agreed. They followed his instructions, not knowing the true cost of what they were about to unleash. On the night of the ritual, under the full moon, the villagers gathered in the center of the village. The outsider drew strange symbols on the ground, chanting words in a language none of them understood. As the ritual reached its climax, the ground beneath them trembled, and a cold wind swept through the village. But when the ritual was done, there was no wealth, no prosperity, only a deep, unsettling silence that settled over the land. The next night, the villagers couldn't sleep. At first, they thought it was just a result of their excitement or perhaps lingering fear from the ritual. But as the nights wore on, they realized something was terribly wrong. No matter how hard they tried, sleep would not come. Their bodies ached with exhaustion, but their minds remained awake, trapped in a constant state of unrest. As the old woman told the story, Rachel felt a growing sense of dread. This wasn't a medical condition. This was something much darker. The villagers had been cursed, bound by the ritual they had performed, and now they were paying the price. The old woman led Rachel to the edge of the village, where a dense forest loomed. "The answers you seek lie within," the old woman said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "But be warned, doctor. The forest is not kind to those who enter it." Rachel stared into the thick trees, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come to find a cure, to help these people, but now she realized that the cure might not be something she could offer as a doctor. This was something older, something ancient and untouchable by modern science. But Rachel was not one to back down. She nodded to the old woman, determination in her eyes. I'll find the answers, she said. The old woman nodded sullenly, but her expression remained grim. Beware the forest, doctor, it remembers. And with that, Rachel turned and began her journey into the dark, twisted forest, where the secrets of the village's curse lay hidden. The forest loomed ahead, dark and uninviting. Rachel stepped cautiously into its shadow, each footfall muffled by the thick underbrush. The trees were ancient, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the air smelled damp and heavy with decay. She pressed on, driven by the need to uncover the truth, though a part of her wondered if she was venturing into something far beyond her understanding. The deeper Rachel ventured into the forest, the quieter it became. Even the usual sounds of nature seemed absent. No birdsong, no rustling of leaves. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Rachel's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to focus, scanning the path ahead for any sign of danger or clue that might explain the curse. Time seemed to blur as she walked, the daylight fading as the thick canopy above blocked out the sun. Soon, Rachel was swallowed by darkness, but she didn't turn back. Somewhere deep in these woods, there had to be an explanation for the village's sleeplessness, and Rachel knew she was the only one who could find it. After what felt like hours, she came to a small clearing. In the center was a stone altar, covered in moss and vines, its surface etched with the same strange symbols the old woman had described from the ritual. The air around the altar felt cold, unnaturally so, and Rachel shivered as she approached. This had to be the place where it all began, the source of the curse. She knelt by the altar, examining the symbols. They were ancient, their meaning lost to time, but Rachel could feel the power they held. She could almost hear whispers on the wind, voices long gone, but still lingering in the air, calling out from the past. This place, it seemed, was more than just the site of a ritual. It was a gateway to something far more dangerous. As Rachel studied the altar, she heard a rustle behind her. She turned quickly, her heart racing, but saw nothing. She was alone, or so it seemed. The forest, however, had a way of playing tricks on the mind, and Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. Suddenly, she noticed a glimmer of movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure, cloaked in shadow, stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the gloom. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, revealing itself to be a tall man, his face obscured by a hood. His presence was unsettling, yet strangely familiar, as if he had been waiting for her. "Who are you?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt to stay calm. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly removed his hood, revealing sharp features and eyes that seemed to gleam in the dim light. "You seek answers," he said, his voice low and steady, almost hypnotic. "But be careful, doctor. The truth you seek may be more than you can handle." Rachel narrowed her eyes, trying to read the stranger's intentions. "The village is cursed," she said. "They haven't slept in years. I need to know why." The man stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "The curse was not meant for them," he said cryptically. "But once it was unleashed, it could not be contained. They are victims of their own desire for power, but there is more at play here than you realize." Rachel's mind raced. The ritual, it was to bring them wealth, wasn't it? But instead, it brought them this torment. The man nodded slowly. "Wealth, power, control. These are the things humans crave. But the price for such things is always greater than what they are willing to pay." Rachel took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Is there a way to stop it? Can they ever sleep again?" The man's expression darkened. "There is a way, but it is not without cost. The one who performed the ritual must undo what was done. The one who sought the power must relinquish it." Rachel frowned, piecing together the clues. The outsider, the one who performed the ritual, he's still here, isn't he? Hiding in the village. The man said nothing, but his silence confirmed her suspicions. Whoever had brought this curse upon the village was still out there somewhere, perhaps watching and waiting for the moment to strike again. Rachel's determination hardened. She couldn't leave these people to suffer, not when the answer was so close. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice filled with resolve. The man looked at her with a mixture of pity and admiration. Find the one responsible. Confront him. But be warned, Doctor, you may not like what you find. With those words, the man turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the forest, leaving Rachel alone with the weight of what she had just learned. She stood there for a moment, processing the information, her mind reeling. Whoever had cursed the village was still there, hidden among them, and it was up to her to uncover the truth. But as she turned to leave the clearing, a sudden chill ran down her spine. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees looming taller and darker than before. Rachel knew that the journey ahead would be even more dangerous than she had imagined. With a deep breath, she steeled herself and began the long walk back to the village, the answers she sought now within reach, but shadowed by an unsettling darkness. She couldn't help but wonder what secrets the villagers were hiding, and more importantly, what she would do when she found the one responsible for their sleepless curse. Rachel returned to the village just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The eerie stillness that had greeted her upon arrival lingered in the air, but now it felt more oppressive. The villagers were beginning their day, their movements slow and heavy, as if the weight of their sleepless nights had drained the very life from their bodies. As she walked through the narrow streets, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that every pair of eyes was watching her, scrutinizing her every move. She wondered how many of them knew about the ritual, how many of them harbored the secret of their sleepless torment. The knowledge she had gained in the forest weighed on her heavily. Someone in this village had caused this curse, and now she had to find out who. The old woman who had first greeted Rachel appeared once again, as if sensing her return. Her face was etched with concern, and her eyes, though tired, still carried the same knowing glimmer. "You've been to the forest," the old woman said softly, her voice carrying the gravity of unspoken truths. "You've seen the altar, haven't you?" Rachel nodded. "I need to know who performed the ritual. I need to know who brought this curse upon you." The old woman hesitated, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "There are things we do not speak of here," she whispered, stepping closer. "But I know what you seek. It is not easy to find the truth, not here." Rachel's frustration bubbled to the surface. "But you know, don't you? You've been here long enough to remember." The old woman sighed deeply, her face etched with the burden of secrets she had carried for years. "I was here when it happened. I watched as the outsider promised us wealth and power. We were all so desperate for a better life. We didn't think of the consequences. It was foolish, but we believed him. And now we are paying the price." "Who was the outsider?" Rachel asked, her voice firm. "Is he still here?" The old woman looked away, her expression clouded with guilt. He became one of us. He blended in, hiding among the villagers. I don't know who he is anymore. Too much time has passed." Rachel's heart sank. The one responsible for the curse was still here, hidden in plain sight, and she had no idea who to trust. "If I can find him, if I can confront him, can the curse be lifted?" The old woman looked uncertain. "Perhaps, but you must be careful. Whoever he is, he's dangerous. He has lived among us for years, and no one has dared to confront him. He will not give up his power easily." Rachel's mind raced. The truth was so close, but it was hidden behind layers of fear and deception. She knew she had to act quickly. The villagers couldn't endure this sleepless torment forever, and the longer she waited, the greater the danger became. "Tell me where to start," Rachel said, her voice steady with determination. The old woman nodded slowly. "There are a few in the village who were closest to the outsider when he first arrived. They might know more, though they have remained silent for years. One of them is the blacksmith, a man named Moyo. He was young when the ritual was performed, but he was there. He saw everything." Rachel thanked the old woman and set off toward the blacksmith's shop. As she walked, the village seemed to close in around her, the weight of its curse pressing down from all sides. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken fear that clung to every person she passed. When she reached the blacksmith's shop, she found Moyo hammering away at a piece of metal, his broad shoulders glistening with sweat. He worked methodically, his face expressionless, but there was something in his eyes, a haunted look, as though he carried a burden too heavy for one man to bear. Rachel approached him cautiously. "Moyo?" The blacksmith looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in her presence. "You're the doctor," he said gruffly, setting down his hammer. "What do you want?" "I need to talk to you," Rachel said, keeping her voice calm but firm. "About the ritual, the one that was performed years ago." Moyo's expression darkened, and he wiped his hands on a cloth, turning away from her. "I don't talk about that." "But you were there," Rachel pressed. "You saw what happened. You know who performed the ritual." Moyo's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Rachel thought he might refuse to speak. But then he sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I was there," he admitted, his voice low. "We all were. We would promise so much. But none of us knew what we were really agreeing to." Rachel stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Who performed the ritual, Moyo? Who brought this curse upon the village?" Moyo hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. "It wasn't one of us," he said finally. "It was an outsider. He came to the village, promising wealth and power, and we believed him. But when the ritual was over, everything changed. The sleepless nights began, and we realized too late that we had been tricked." "Who was the outsider?" Rachel asked urgently. "Is he still here?" Moyo's face twisted with anger and regret. "Yes," he whispered. "He never left. He blended in with the rest of us, hiding in plain sight. We've lived with him all these years, never knowing who he really was." Rachel's blood ran cold. The man responsible for the curse was still living among the villagers, hidden in plain sight, and no one had dared to confront him. She felt a surge of anger, both at the outsider and at the villagers who had let this happen. "Where do I find him?" she demanded. Moyo shook his head. "I don't know. No one does. He's been hiding for so long. We don't even know what he looks like anymore." Rachel clenched her fists in frustration. The man responsible for all the suffering was still out there, and yet he remained just out of reach, hidden among the very people he had cursed. "I'll find him," she vowed, her voice filled with determination. "I'll stop him." Moyo looked at her with weary eyes. "Be careful, doctor. He's dangerous. If you confront him, you may not survive." Rachel nodded grimly. She had come too far to turn back now. The village's sleepless curse had gone on long enough, and it was time for the truth to be revealed, no matter the cost. Rachel felt the weight of her task pressing down on her as she left the blacksmith's shop. She had come to this village expecting to find a medical explanation for the strange affliction of sleeplessness, but the truth was far darker and more complicated than anything she could have imagined. Somewhere among the villagers, the outsider who had performed the ritual was still hiding, living undetected for all these years. The curse had persisted because of him, and if Rachel was to help these people, she needed to confront him. But where to begin? Rachel knew she couldn't trust anyone. The outsider could be anyone, perhaps even someone who had befriended her since her arrival. Every face she passed seemed more sinister now, every smile hiding secrets. She needed to be cautious, but at the same time, she couldn't afford to wait too long. The sleeplessness was beginning to take a toll on the village's sanity, and soon it would be too late. As the sun began to sink behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, Rachel made her way toward the village's central square. There, the townspeople had gathered around a large fire, their gaunt faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The atmosphere was tense, and Rachel could sense their exhaustion, their growing desperation. She stood at the edge of the gathering, watching as the villagers murmured among themselves, their voices hushed and filled with uncertainty. The old woman from before caught her eye, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. Rachel knew she couldn't act too quickly, but she needed to start observing, looking for signs, anything that would give away the identity of the one responsible for the curse. As the night deepened, the firelight casting eerie shadows across the square, Rachel noticed something strange. A man standing on the outskirts of the gathering seemed detached, as though he was observing the villagers rather than participating in the conversations. His face was lined with age, but there was something about him that struck Rachel as odd. He didn't seem as tired as the others, his movements less sluggish, his eyes sharper. Could this be him? Could this be the outsider who had cursed the village? Rachel moved closer, keeping a careful eye on the man. He was speaking quietly to another villager, but his gaze darted around, as though he were wary of being watched. Her instincts told her that this was someone she needed to investigate further. As the villagers began to disperse, the fire slowly dying down, Rachel made her move. She followed the man at a distance, watching as he made his way toward the outskirts of the village. He moved quickly, and Rachel had to be careful not to lose sight of him. The village streets were dark, with only a few lanterns lighting the way, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and shift with every step she took. The man disappeared into a small house at the edge of the village, and Rachel hesitated for a moment before moving closer. She needed to confront him, but she couldn't do it alone. The old woman's warning echoed in her mind. This man was dangerous, and if he truly was the one who had performed the ritual, there was no telling what he might do if cornered. But Rachel couldn't wait any longer. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and knocked on the door. There was no answer at first, just the eerie silence that had come to define the village. But after a moment, the door creaked open, and the man stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cold and guarded. Rachel's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "I need to talk to you. About the ritual." The man's eyes flickered with something, recognition, perhaps fear, and for a moment, Rachel thought he might slam the door in her face, but instead he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The inside of the house was sparse, with little more than a few pieces of furniture and a fire burning low in the hearth. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and something else, something Rachel couldn't quite place. She turned to face the man, who was now watching her with an intense gaze. "You're the doctor," he said, more a statement than a question. "You've been asking questions about the curse." "I have," Rachel replied, her voice firm. "The villagers told me about the ritual. I know someone performed it years ago, promising wealth and power, but instead, it cursed the village with sleeplessness." The man's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes darkened. "And you think I had something to do with it?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted. "But you were there, weren't you? You know more than you're letting on." For a long moment, the man said nothing, simply staring into the fire as though lost in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with bitterness. "I was there," he said, "but I didn't cause this." Rachel frowned, confused. Then who did? The man turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. It wasn't one person. The village brought this on itself. They were greedy, desperate for something more than the life they had. They wanted power, wealth, prosperity. And when the outsider came, offering all of that, they didn't hesitate. Rachel listened, her mind racing. But someone had to perform the ritual. Someone had to lead them. The man's gaze flickered with pain. "It was the village elder," he said quietly. "He was the one who agreed to the outsider's terms. He led the ritual, believing it would save us. But it was a mistake, a terrible mistake." Rachel felt a surge of frustration. The village elder, was he still alive? Could he be the one who needed to undo the curse? "The elder," Rachel said urgently. "Is he still here? Can he reverse what was done?" The man shook his head slowly. "The elder died years ago, shortly after the sleeplessness began. His death was the first sign that something had gone horribly wrong. We were left to live with the consequences." Rachel's heart sank. The one who had led the ritual was gone, and with him, perhaps, the only chance to undo the curse. But still, there had to be another way. The villagers couldn't be condemned to live like this forever. "Is there no other way to lift the curse?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. The man looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "There might be," he said slowly, "but it's dangerous. To undo the curse, someone must return to the altar and perform another ritual, a ritual of sacrifice." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. What kind of sacrifice? The man's expression grew darker. A life must be given to the gods, a life for the sleep of the village. Rachel felt the weight of the man's words settle heavily in her chest. A life must be sacrificed to lift the curse. The very thought sent a chill through her. This was no longer a matter of medicine or science. This was something far darker, something that went beyond anything she had been trained to handle. And yet, she had come too far to turn back now. There has to be another way, Rachel said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't sure she believed them. There must be some other way to lift the curse without taking a life. The man shook his head, his face hard with grim certainty. If there is, I don't know it. The ritual that cursed us was sealed with blood, and only blood can break it. It's the way of things. It's how the gods keep their balance. Rachel's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. She had been called here to help these people, to find a cure for their sleeplessness. But what she had uncovered was something far more insidious. The curse was not a disease. It was the result of human greed and ancient magic. And now the only solution seemed to be a sacrifice. She looked at the man, searching for any sign of hope, some clue that there might be another path. But his eyes, hollow and resigned, told her everything she needed to know. If I do this, Rachel said slowly, if I perform the ritual and make the sacrifice, will it work? Will the villagers finally be able to sleep? The man's gaze shifted, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of something other than cold certainty in his eyes. Was it doubt? Or perhaps guilt? I don't know, he admitted. No one's ever tried. The elder died before we could even consider it. And after that, no one was brave enough to attempt the ritual again. Rachel swallowed hard. The idea of sacrificing someone's life to lift the curse was horrifying. But if it meant saving the village, if it meant ending their torment, could she really turn away? She thought of the old woman, of Moyo, of the hollow-eyed villagers who had lived with this curse for so long. Could she really walk away and leave them to suffer? Who? Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Who must be sacrificed? The man hesitated, his face darkening. The one who offers their life must be someone with power. Someone who has something to give to the gods in exchange for sleep. It can't be just anyone. Rachel's heart sank. And you think, I'm the one who has to do it? The man's eyes met hers, and she saw the answer in his gaze before he even spoke. You're the only one who came here willingly. You've shown courage and determination. The gods might accept your sacrifice in exchange for the village's salvation. Rachel felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her. Huh? She had come here to help these people, but she had never imagined it would come to this. Was she really prepared to give up her life for a village she barely knew? The man seemed to sense her hesitation. I know it's not fair, he said quietly. But sometimes, the gods demand more than we're willing to give. That's the price of power. Rachel stood in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the decision pressing down on her from all sides. She thought of her life back in the city, the patients she had saved, the colleagues she had worked alongside, the future she had imagined for herself. Was she really ready to leave all of that behind? But then she thought of the village. She thought of the people who had endured years of sleepless torment, their bodies and minds slowly breaking down under the weight of the curse. She thought of the old woman who had lived with the secret of the ritual for so long, and of Moyo, whose haunted eyes spoke of years of guilt and regret. Rachel knew what she had to do. She had come to this village to help, and now she understood that helping meant more than just curing an illness. It meant breaking a curse, no matter the cost. I'll do it, Rachel said, her voice steady. I'll perform the ritual. The man looked at her, a mixture of surprise and sadness crossing his face. Are you sure? He asked. Once you commit to this, there's no turning back. Rachel nodded. I'm sure. I can't let these people suffer any longer. The man's expression softened, and for a moment, Rachel thought she saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. Then we'll prepare for the ritual, he said. It must be done at the altar, at midnight. I'll guide you through the process, but after that, it's up to you. Rachel nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over her. The decision had been made. She had accepted her fate, and now all that was left was to carry it out. As she left the man's house and walked back toward the center of the village, Rachel couldn't help but notice how quiet everything seemed. The usual low murmur of the villagers was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. It was as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. That night, Rachel lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling as the hours ticked by. She had made her decision, but now, in the stillness of the night, doubts began to creep in. Was she really doing the right thing? Would the gods accept her sacrifice? Or was this all just a cruel trick, a final test before the village was consumed by the curse forever? As midnight approached, Rachel rose from her bed and made her way toward the forest. The sky was dark, with only a sliver of moonlight illuminating the path ahead. The air was thick with tension, and Rachel could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the altar. The man was waiting for her, standing beside the stone altar with a look of solemn determination on his face. He had prepared everything. The symbols had been redrawn, and the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs. The scene felt eerily similar to the description the old woman had given of the original ritual, and Rachel couldn't help but wonder if the villagers had felt the same mix of fear and anticipation all those years ago. "It's time," the man said quietly, gesturing for Rachel to step forward. Rachel took a deep breath and approached the altar. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the cold stone, feeling the weight of the ritual pressing down on her. She closed her eyes, waiting for the man to guide her through the process, but all she could hear was the deafening silence of the forest. "Begin," the man said, his voice low and steady. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she began to speak the words of the ritual, the ancient language feeling foreign on her tongue. She didn't know what the words meant, but as she spoke them, she could feel the power behind them, the weight of the gods pressing down on her with each syllable. The wind began to pick up, swirling around the clearing as if the very air was responding to the ritual. Rachel's voice grew louder, stronger, as she called out to the gods, begging them to lift the curse, to allow the villagers to sleep once more. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the wind stopped. The forest fell silent, and for a moment, Rachel felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. It was done. But as she opened her eyes, she realized something was wrong. The man was gone. Rachel's heart raced as she stared at the empty space where the man had stood just moments before. The air, which had felt so heavy with tension, was now eerily still. The forest around her was silent, as if holding its breath. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She called out into the darkness, her voice shaking. "Where are you? What's happening?" There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the forest. Rachel felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her chest. She had trusted the man, believed that he was guiding her through the ritual to lift the curse, but now it seemed as if she had been left to face the consequences alone. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled, a low rumble rising from deep within the earth. The stones of the altar began to glow faintly, a sickly green light emanating from the symbols etched into its surface. Rachel stepped back, her breath quickening. The ritual had been completed, but something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The wind returned, swirling violently around the clearing, kicking up dust and leaves. The trees groaned as they swayed in the gusts, their branches creaking like old bones. Rachel shielded her face from the debris, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. Just then, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, emerging from the shadows. Rachel's pulse quickened as she recognized the figure, the old woman who had first welcomed her to the village. Her gray hair whipped in the wind, and her eyes gleamed with an intensity Rachel hadn't seen before. "You shouldn't have done this," the old woman said, her voice carrying over the howling wind. Rachel stared at her, confusion and fear mixing in her chest. "What do you mean? I was told the ritual would lift the curse." The old woman shook her head, her expression grave. "The curse was never meant to be lifted so easily. The gods demand a price, but the ritual you performed, it wasn't what you thought it was." Rachel's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "That man, he told me it would work." The old woman's eyes narrowed. "That man is no villager. He's the one who brought the curse upon us all those years ago. The outsider. He tricked you." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The man, the one she had trusted, the one who had guided her through the ritual, was the outsider. the very person responsible for the village's sleepless torment. It all began to make a horrifying kind of sense. No, Rachel whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. That can't be true. He said he wanted to help. The old woman's face was filled with pity. He lied. He used you to complete his work. The ritual you performed wasn't to break the curse, it was to strengthen it. He needed someone with pure intentions to carry it out. Someone the gods would listen to. And now, the curse is stronger than ever. Rachel felt the weight of the old woman's words settle over her like a suffocating blanket. She had been tricked, manipulated into helping the very man who had condemned the village to this sleepless existence. And now, because of her, the curse was worse than before. The ground shook again, more violently this time, and the altar's glow intensified, casting an eerie light over the entire clearing. The wind howled louder, and Rachel could feel the air thickening with the weight of the curse. What do we do? Rachel asked, her voice filled with desperation. How do we stop this? The old woman's face hardened. There's only one way to end the curse now. You must find the outsider and confront him. Only he can reverse what's been done. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. The outsider, the man who had tricked her, was out there somewhere, likely already preparing to disappear again. But if she didn't stop him, the village would be doomed to suffer even more than they already had. Where is he? Rachel asked, her voice trembling with urgency. The old woman looked out into the darkness of the forest. He'll be hiding. He knows the village will come for him once they realize what's happened. You must find him before it's too late. Rachel nodded, fear and determination warring within her. She had to find him. She couldn't let him escape, not after what he had done, not after he had used her to make the curse stronger. Without another word, Rachel turned and ran into the forest, her mind racing. The wind continued to howl around her, the trees bending and creaking as though the very forest was alive with the power of the curse. She had no idea where the man might have gone, but she knew she didn't have much time. As she ran, the night seemed to close in around her, the darkness growing thicker, the air colder. The path before her twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the forest's heart. Every step felt like a step into the unknown, but Rachel refused to stop. She couldn't stop, not until she had found the man and forced him to undo what he had done. Suddenly, she spotted movement up ahead, a figure darting between the trees. Rachel's heart leaped into her throat as she realized it was him, the outsider. He was running, trying to escape, but she wasn't going to let him get away. Stop! Rachel shouted, her voice cutting through the wind. The man didn't stop. He ran faster, disappearing into the darkness. Rachel pushed herself harder, her legs burning as she sprinted after him. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches clawing at her as she passed, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't let him escape. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel burst into another clearing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The outsider stood at the far end, his back to her as he stared up at a massive stone structure, another altar, far larger than the one she had seen before. This ends now, Rachel called out, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. The man turned slowly, his face calm, almost serene. It was never going to end, he said softly. Not for them. Not for you. Rachel's fists clenched at her sides. You tricked me. You made me believe I was helping them, but you've made it worse. Why? The man smiled faintly. Because the gods demand it. They crave power, and power comes from sacrifice. This village was always meant to suffer. It's how the balance is maintained. Rachel took a step forward, her heart pounding. Undo it. Now. The man's smile faded, and for a moment, something dark flickered in his eyes. You think you can command the gods? You think they'll listen to you? Rachel's hands trembled, but she refused to back down. I won't let you do this. You've destroyed these people's lives, and I won't stand by and let you get away with it. The man's gaze hardened, and the wind around them picked up, swirling violently as though responding to his unspoken command. You don't understand, Doctor. This village was cursed long before I arrived. I only showed them the truth, and now, it's too late to stop it. Rachel's pulse quickened as she realized that the man had no intention of undoing the curse. He was here to ensure that it remained, that the village continued to suffer. But Rachel couldn't accept that. She couldn't leave these people to their fate, not after everything she had been through. She glanced at the altar behind the man, its surface etched with the same ancient symbols she had seen before. The key to the curse was here. She was certain of it. If she could reach the altar, if she could destroy it, maybe, just maybe, she could break the curse once and for all. With a surge of adrenaline, Rachel lunged toward the altar, her heart racing. The man's eyes widened in surprise as she moved, but before he could react, Rachel grabbed a large stone from the ground and hurled it at the altar. The stone struck the altar with a deafening crack, and the symbols on its surface began to glow, pulsing with a sickly green light. The wind howled louder, and the ground beneath Rachel's feet trembled violently, as though the very earth was reacting to the destruction of the altar. "No!" the man shouted, his voice filled with fury. "You don't know what you're doing." But Rachel didn't stop. She grabbed another stone and struck the altar again, this time shattering one of the symbols completely. The ground heaved beneath her, and the wind whipped around her with terrifying force, but she refused to back down. As the altar crumbled before her, Rachel felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of relief. She had done it. She had destroyed the source of the curse. But as she turned to face the man, her victory was short-lived. His eyes blazed with fury, and the air around him crackled with energy. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You've only made it worse." Rachel's heart sank as she realized the truth. The altar wasn't just the source of the curse. It was the only thing keeping it contained. And now, with the altar destroyed, the curse was free.